It started like so many stories in Hollywood do, with a party. In 2018, Brad Pitt was at an Oscars after-party in Beverly Hills, a familiar environment, controlled, glamorous, full of the industry's elite. That night, Sean "Diddy" Combs approached him. It wasn't out of place. Two icons from different arenas, both orbiting the same social solar system. Diddy complimented him, saying he admired how Brad managed to stay off the grid despite being everywhere. Brad laughed. Diddy didn't. It was in that exchange that the tone shifted. What began as light conversation quickly turned into something different. There was an invitation, casual, disarming, but oddly specific. "You should come by my place sometime, just us. Talk like men. Real men." Brad hesitated. The wording was strange, but curiosity won. A week later, he was at Diddy's mansion in Los Angeles. It was late when he arrived. Diddy greeted him, wearing silk pajamas. He told Brad he didn't believe in small talk after dark. At first, Brad brushed it off as eccentricity, rich people rituals. The house itself was unsettling in ways that didn't immediately register. Dark hallways stretched like shadows. Incense lingered in the air, almost masking something metallic. Mirrors were tilted at odd angles. The music playing never resolved, just looped, like time folding in on itself. It was a sensory trap disguised as ambiance. Brad stayed. He doesn't explain why, just that he didn't leave. That night was the beginning of a shift he couldn't name at the time. Diddy eventually led him downstairs. Brad expected a wine cellar or a theater. Instead, he found something entirely different, a ritual space. That's what he called it. Steam showers were built into the walls. Candles were already lit. Thick rugs muffled the sound of footsteps. Mirrors were everywhere. It felt staged, like a set built for something unspoken. Diddy handed Brad a glass of brown liquor and said, "You've made it. Now let's clean off the rest of who you used to be." Brad was confused, but played along. Then Diddy started undressing. He asked Brad to join him in the shower. Brad said no. Diddy smiled. "It's just water. Just trust." There was no force, no physical coercion. But there was pressure, intangible, heavy, silent. Brad stepped into the water. The house staff moved like shadows just outside the door. Upstairs, Diddy's family was home. That detail stuck with Brad more than anything, that somewhere above this carefully curated strangeness, people were living normal lives. Nothing explicitly sexual happened, Brad clarified. But the emotional confusion, the vulnerability, the almost spiritual framing of intimacy, it left a deeper scar. Diddy whispered things like, "This is how kings reconnect," and "You're safe now because you're with me." Brad stood there disconnected from his own body while water ran over both of them for nearly 10 minutes. Afterward, Diddy handed him a robe and said, "Come back anytime you want to feel real again." Brad left, didn't sleep for 3 nights, and still, he returned. This was the opening act, an initiation not into friendship but into something far more calculated, a world where silence was currency and control was masked as closeness. Brad didn't know it then, but he had stepped into a carefully engineered system, one that didn't trap you by force, but by disorientation, by confusion, by suggestion. By the time he understood what was really happening, it was already too late. Brad Pitt didn't leave that night, and that choice became a turning point he wouldn't fully understand for years. What unfolded in Diddy's basement wasn't violence. It wasn't a scene from a crime thriller. It was something much more insidious, something that blurred boundaries in a way that made you question your own instincts. Brad described the environment not as chaotic or threatening, but calculated. Every detail, from the rugs that muted sound to the pre-lit candles and mirrored surfaces, was designed to create a reality that bent around the visitor. There was no small talk, No music with lyrics, no phones, just silence, smoke, and surveillance, masked as mystique. He said the air felt thick like it carried weight. The steam from the shower didn't just fog the mirrors, it fogged his thinking. The way Diddy spoke, the phrases he used, "This is how kings reconnect," and "You're safe now because you're with me," sounded at first like self-help jargon or New Age nonsense. But in that moment, under the pressure of atmosphere and suggestion, they landed differently. It wasn't about being safe. It was about surrender. And even then, Brad tried to rationalize it. Maybe this was just Diddy's style. An eccentric billionaire being weird. Hollywood was full of those. He told himself it was weird, sure, but maybe it was just a quirky ritual. Nothing had happened, he reminded himself. Nothing physical, nothing he couldn't walk away from. But he didn't walk away. He came back. Not immediately, but soon. Because what he realized later was that the manipulation wasn't about force. It was about invitation, about curiosity, about power disguised as intimacy. He described feeling off-kilter in the days that followed, restless, like something had been dislodged inside him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about the house, the silence, the mirrors. But more than that, he couldn't stop thinking about how he felt while he was there, like his own sense of reality had been overwritten by someone else's design. When he returned to Diddy's home for a second visit, he noticed new things. The way he was escorted in through the side, not the front door. The staff, always present, never speaking. The way the house seemed to change shape depending on who was inside. This time there was no shower, no liquor, just Diddy, again in pajamas, talking about energy, trust, and the idea that men at the top lived by different rules. It felt philosophical on the surface, but underneath, it was something else, something more about erasing boundaries than building trust. Brad didn't say much that night. He listened, watched, tried to figure out what this was. Was it a test, a performance, or just something rich people did to keep themselves entertained? The more he tried to understand, the more disoriented he became. And maybe that was the point. Confusion, he later realized, was part of the design. You weren't supposed to understand. You were supposed to follow. The third time he visited, the pattern solidified. There was always something ritualistic, a schedule without clocks, a space without labels, a code of behavior that wasn't spoken but deeply enforced. Brad began to feel like he was inside a play he hadn't auditioned for, being given stage directions in real time without a script. And yet he followed. Not because he agreed, not because he enjoyed it, but because the atmosphere had made questioning feel impossible. Resistance felt like betrayal, not of Diddy, but of some invisible bond that had already been formed. It wasn't until much later that Brad found the language for what had happened in those early visits. At the time, he couldn't articulate it. He just knew that after each encounter, he felt less certain of himself. He'd go home, shower again, trying to scrub off the feeling. But the feeling wasn't physical. It was existential. Like he had been temporarily rewritten. What made it harder was the contrast between the world inside Diddy's house and the world outside. Out there, Brad Pitt was the movie star, the icon, untouchable. But inside, all of that stripped away. No one called him Brad with reverence. He was just another participant in something much bigger, much older, and far more orchestrated than he could have imagined. Diddy didn't just play host, he played director. Every move, every glance, every phrase felt rehearsed, yet deeply personal. Like he knew exactly how to pull people apart and rebuild them in his own image. And Brad wasn't the only one. That much was clear. There were glimpses, shadows of others moving through the house, names that were never mentioned but whose presence was implied. People he recognized from red carpets and headlines, now stripped of their public identities. The brotherhood, as Diddy would later call it, wasn't about friendship. It was about ownership, a network of silence and submission. But that realization wouldn't come until later. For now, Brad was still inside it, still trying to make sense of the invitations, the rituals, the strange mix of luxury and isolation. The story hadn't become dark yet. It was still shrouded in the language of trust and bonding, still wrapped in the aesthetics of elegance and secrecy. Yet under all of it, something was breaking. Brad didn't know what it was, only that he was starting to lose track of the line between choice and influence, between who he was and who he was becoming. And in a world that worshipped freedom, that kind of confusion was the first real warning sign. What happened next would strip away the mystique. The rituals would deepen, the rules would sharpen, and the illusion of safety would shatter. But that was later. For now, Brad was still walking into that house, still telling himself he had control, still thinking he could leave any time, still believing somehow that this wasn't the start of something he'd spend years trying to forget. The deeper Brad Pitt went into Diddy's world, the more the rules began to shift, quietly, almost invisibly. It wasn't just about strange dinners or confusing energy talk anymore. It was about power and control. It started with the invitations. They didn't come in the usual way, not through assistants or agents. The first one arrived in gold parchment, folded carefully, handwritten in black ink. No date, just a time and a phrase. Come with nothing, leave with nothing. It was vague, ominous, but Brad was already in too deep to ignore it. Curiosity had long stopped being the reason he showed up. By now, it was something else, something closer to compulsion. When he arrived, the process was familiar but more intense. He was escorted through a hallway he hadn't seen before, one that bypassed the main areas of the house. At the end was a room bathed in red light, lit entirely by chandeliers hanging low like warnings. A long glass table stretched across the room. No plates, no chairs, no cutlery, just the table and an ambient classical track playing on loop, distorted, slightly like it was glitching. Brad stood there, unsure. Then Diddy entered, completely naked. Not a word, not a thread of clothing, just a gesture. Lay down. This is communion, Diddy whispered. And Brad did what he was told. The ritual wasn't violent. It wasn't physical in the traditional sense, but it was deeply violating. They lay side by side on the glass surface, vulnerable, exposed, surrounded by mirrors. No one spoke. There was no food, no eye contact, just the sound of their breathing and the distant echo of the music. Brad tried to convince himself it was some kind of performance art, a twisted version of expression. Maybe this was what billionaires did when they got bored, but by the third such dinner, that illusion collapsed. He began to notice the details, the little things that didn't fit, tiny black lenses embedded in light fixtures, reflections in the mirrors that didn't quite match, a shadow that moved when nothing else did. It clicked. They were being filmed, not accidentally, not by mistake, intentionally. Brad confronted Diddy afterward, asked if this was a project, a shoot, something experimental. Diddy just smiled and said, "No one believes art unless it's archived." That line haunted Brad. That night, he went home and tore through his house. He searched every corner for hidden cameras, pulled mirrors off walls, checked vents. He didn't know if he was being paranoid or finally waking up. Either way, something had shifted. He no longer felt watched. He felt recorded, cataloged. And what terrified him most wasn't that he'd been filmed. It was that he didn't remember consenting. He didn't remember saying yes. And yet, there he was in the footage, lying on the table, motionless and silent. Then came the document, delivered in a navy leather folder sealed in gold, titled, Wellness Agreement, Private Communion Protocol. At first, Brad thought it was a joke, but it had weight, legal weight. It bore Diddy's signature, a notary seal, and Brad's full name at the top. The contents were disturbing. Clauses that banned discussing shared cleansing experiences, outlawed mentioning gathering formats, even dictated how silence would be interpreted as consent. The message was clear. If you don't speak, you've agreed. Brad didn't sign it. But not signing didn't seem to matter. That week, things began to unravel. Calls stopped being returned. A charity deal Brad had been working on with a tech company vanished without explanation. Rumors started spreading. He was unstable, in crisis, unreliable. No one said it outright, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. And then came the gifts. They arrived at random, unmarked packages sent to different properties. Inside, black candles shaped like faceless human forms. Incense sticks soaked in chemicals that burned with a sickly scent. A single white feather sealed in a glass case. All meaningless on their own, but together, unmistakably intentional. Brad tried to trace them, hired his assistant to follow the trail. But there was nothing. No return address, no fingerprints, no explanation. Just symbols meant to remind him that he was still inside the system. The final straw was a note. Left under his gate during a rainstorm, the paper warped and bleeding ink. But the message was clear. You're in the Brotherhood now. Don't break the circle. Brad read it again and again, not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. This wasn't about friendship. It wasn't about mentorship or collaboration. It was about control. He hadn't been invited. He had been absorbed. This was the system. A carefully constructed maze built on ambiguity, coercion, and fear. The showers, the dinners, the silence. It was all part of a larger mechanism, one that didn't need to restrain you with chains. It restrained you with implication. You weren't told what you couldn't say. You were made to feel what would happen if you said it. Brad said the worst part wasn't the isolation or the rumors. It was the doubt. The creeping uncertainty that maybe he'd let it happen. Maybe he hadn't fought hard enough. Maybe silence did mean agreement. But he knew better. Deep down, he knew this wasn't about weakness. It was about design. About a man who understood how to build a cage you wouldn't even notice until the door was locked. By the time Brad realized the scale of it all, it was too late. He wasn't just being watched, he was being shaped. And every attempt to resist, to question, to confront, was met not with violence, but with erasure. You didn't get screamed at. You got sidelined, slowly, strategically, until you stopped. Talking because no one was listening anyway. That's how the system worked. Not with force, with silence. Brad Pitt didn't wake up one morning and decide to call it trauma. For a long time, he called it a misunderstanding, then a strange friendship, then nothing at all. But the truth was never that simple. The aftermath wasn't sudden. It unfolded slowly, like a shadow stretching across his life. At first, it looked like stress, insomnia, mood swings. He stopped going out as much, pulled back from press, declined events without offering excuses. The world assumed he was just retreating from the spotlight, aging out of the fame machine. But inside, something much darker was happening. He couldn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, the images returned. The sound of water hitting tile. The smell of burning incense. The phrase, "You'll never be clean again." He began avoiding mirrors. Not out of vanity, but because they reminded him of the ones in Diddy's basement. Mirrors that recorded instead of reflected. Even in his own home, he didn't feel safe. He would walk into a room and scan every corner, looking for lenses, for gaps in the wall, for signs that he was still being watched. Professionally, the fallout was quieter, but just as devastating. A major film deal he'd been nurturing for months suddenly vanished. No reason given, no call back, just silence. His team noticed the pattern, Calls unreturned, meetings canceled, projects shelved. When one producer finally texted him, the message was chilling. "You upset someone you shouldn't have. I can't help you this time." That was the moment Brad understood. This wasn't coincidence. It was consequence. People didn't threaten him directly. They didn't need to. The system worked better with implication, with fear. And fear made people compliant. Not just him, but those around him. Agents stopped pushing. Publicists started hedging. Even friends who once checked in regularly became distant. No one said it out loud, but Brad knew they didn't want to get too close to whatever was happening. They didn't want to be next. Then came the most terrifying delivery of all. It was spring 2022. A man Brad didn't recognize showed up at his private gate in Los Feliz. No words, no car, just a sleek black box handed off to Brad's assistant, who assumed it was some kind of luxury gift. Inside, there were photographs, dozens of them, high resolution, carefully staged. Images from the basement, from the shower, from above, from the side, angles Brad hadn't even known existed. In several, Diddy was there, smiling, proud. The pictures weren't sexual, but they were intimate, and they were invasive. That was the point. Alongside the photos was a USB drive. Brad waited hours before plugging it in. When he did, what he found was worse than he imagined. Footage from the silent dinners, from the rituals. One clip showed Diddy whispering in Brad's ear, something Brad had no memory of, but there it was, on camera. And then came the final clip. Diddy alone speaking directly to the lens. "There's beauty in power, especially when it's borrowed. You borrowed mine, Brad. Remember that." Brad watched the clip 3 times. Then he called his lawyer. The legal advice was blunt. Do not retaliate. Do not speak. "It's too dangerous," they said. "You'll lose everything." So he stayed quiet. But the silence became unbearable. He moved the photos to a safety deposit box, hid the drive. But the memories stayed. The fear didn't fade. He still couldn't use his own shower without flinching. He still stood outside it, frozen, remembering what it felt like to be watched under the guise of being welcomed. And then came the voice on the phone. No caller ID, no introduction. Just a calm, even tone. "Tell him to keep his mouth shut or we'll shut it for him." It wasn't a scream. It wasn't angry. It was rehearsed, precise. Brad sat in silence after the call ended. And then he made a decision. But that moment hadn't come yet. What lingered most in those months was the internal erosion. He didn't feel like himself anymore. He didn't feel like anyone. Fame, he realized, was useless in a world like this. It didn't protect him. It didn't empower him. It only made him more valuable as a target. In Diddy's world, fame wasn't a shield. It was currency. And Diddy owned the bank. Brad didn't talk to anyone about it for a long time. Not his team, not his family. But people noticed the change. His manager cried when Brad finally opened up. "I knew something was off," he said. "I just didn't know how bad it was." That was the first time Brad understood he hadn't been completely alone. Others had seen it. They just didn't know what they were seeing. He wasn't losing his mind. He was surviving a system designed to dismantle you piece by piece. By then, the damage had already been done. The missed opportunities, the broken partnerships, the growing sense that he was radioactive. Brad couldn't prove any of it. That was the brilliance of the system. It left no fingerprints, only echoes. But he knew what had happened. He had lived it. And eventually, the weight of silence became heavier than the risk of speaking. But that came later. First, he had to admit the truth to himself. He hadn't walked away from Diddy's world. He had been released, and only after Diddy was sure that Brad knew what he still owned, not his image, not his career, but his silence. Brad Pitt never set out to become a symbol of resistance. He didn't plan on testifying. For over a year after receiving that black box with the photographs and footage, he lived in a kind of quiet torment. He withdrew from the industry's spotlight, skipped events, stopped giving interviews, and created distance from colleagues who might have asked too many questions. On the surface, it looked like a Hollywood veteran taking a step back. But inside, Brad was unraveling. The images haunted him. Not just the ones on the USB drive, but the ones that lived in his mind, the flickering memory of candles reflecting, off red glass, the echo of footsteps down that mirrored hallway, the water running in the basement shower. He couldn't scrub it from his thoughts. Every sound became a trigger. Every silence felt like surveillance. Then something changed. He saw the footage from the trial, another testimony. This time it was Cassie, a woman whose story bore chilling similarities to his own. Suddenly, Brad realized he wasn't the exception. He was the pattern. All those moments he had spent trying to rationalize what happened, explaining it away as a one-off, something weird but isolated, it all collapsed. He wasn't alone, and that realization hit like a thunderclap. He began having flashbacks again, not just memories but full-body reactions. Waking episodes where he'd smell that same incense, hear the looped classical music, feel the steam of a shower that wasn't his. He started writing everything down, every detail he could remember. At first, just for himself. But then the threats returned. Another anonymous call. No caller ID, just a low voice on the other end. "Tell him to keep his mouth shut, or we'll..." "Shut it for him." Brad sat in silence for a full minute after the call ended. And then he made the decision. This had to stop. The silence had to end. He told his team he was going to testify. He expected pushback, expected panic. But instead, his manager cried. "I knew something was wrong," he said. "I just didn't know how deep it went." That moment gave Brad a glimmer of strength. He had spent so long believing he was alone in carrying the weight of this secret. But now he saw it clearly. Others had seen the signs. They just didn't have the words. Just like him, he didn't come forward for revenge. He wasn't trying to reclaim his image or spark a viral moment. He came forward because he couldn't carry it anymore. "If I stayed silent," he said, "I'd be exactly what he made me, a prop." Testifying wasn't liberation. It was terrifying. He didn't feel free when he walked into that courtroom. He felt like a man stepping onto a wire stretched over years of silence and shame. But still, he walked forward. Because for the first time, he had found something more powerful than fear. Clarity. He sat in that courtroom and delivered his truth with a quiet, raw edge. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't polished, it was real. He told the jury, "I'm not a victim looking for sympathy. I'm a man trying to make peace with the parts of myself that got trapped in that basement." And that line, so simple, so direct, hit like a lightning bolt. It wasn't just about Diddy. It wasn't even about Brad. It was about every person who's ever been silenced by power, who's ever been told that secrecy is safer than truth. As he continued, Brad's voice trembled, but his focus sharpened. He explained how he used to think Diddy wanted loyalty, or friendship, or even connection. But now he saw the truth. "He wanted trophies," Brad said, "and I was one of them." It was a statement that shattered illusions, not just for the jury, but for anyone watching. Brad Pitt, a man who had spent decades carefully crafting his public identity, was now tearing it down in full view. Not for drama, but for justice. He described how for months, even years, he tried to shrink himself to stay safe. He stopped asking questions, avoided confrontation, told himself it was over. But Diddy didn't forget, and the system didn't release him. Because systems built on control don't care about time. They care about obedience. Brad recalled standing alone in his own bathroom months after his last contact with Diddy, just staring at the floor of his shower, frozen. "I couldn't step in," he said. "I stood there for 20 minutes shaking, because it wasn't just a shower anymore. It was a memory I couldn't scrub away." That image, the movie star reduced to silence in his own home, cut through all the noise. The courtroom remained frozen as Brad turned to Diddy for the first time during his testimony. Their eyes locked, the air between them thickened. "You didn't break me," Brad said, "but you did something worse. You made me question who I was." That sentence carried decades of weight, decades of silence. And then Brad turned back to the judge. "I'm here today not to protect my legacy," he said, "but to finally draw a line in the sand. You don't get to own my silence anymore." It wasn't a speech. It was an exorcism. Brad closed with one final statement, one that wasn't dramatic or angry. It was cold, precise, and devastating. "You called it connection. You called it trust. But what you really built was a prison, and I've served my time." The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It just sat there, still, breathless, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Outside, the world was already shifting. Reporters didn't have sound bites yet. Social media hadn't decided what the hashtag should be, but inside that courtroom, something undeniable had happened. Brad Pitt had spoken, and the illusion, the one that said men like him couldn't be victims, that silence was strength, was broken. Brad Pitt's testimony didn't feel like a performance. It wasn't poetic or neatly packaged. It felt like survival. And in a culture that has long demanded perfection from its stars and silence from its victims, what he did on that stand wasn't just brave, it was revolutionary. For over an hour, the courtroom was transported, not by spectacle, but by truth. A truth that had been buried beneath decades of Hollywood polish, fame, and fear. A truth that most never imagined could come from someone like him. But that was the point. That was the illusion he shattered. He didn't tell his story with anger. He told it with weight. You could hear it in his voice, in the spaces between his words. You could see it in how he sat, how he breathed, how his eyes scanned the room like he was still watching for shadows. When he said, "I've served my time," it wasn't a metaphor. It was the closing sentence of a sentence he never volunteered for. One written by someone else, enacted in silence, enforced through shame. Brad spoke about identity, the way fame used to make him feel untouchable, like he was protected by an image. But in Diddy's world, that image wasn't armor, it was leverage. Diddy didn't care about Brad the movie star. He cared about Brad the silence, Brad the submission, Brad the symbol. And once that symbol was secured, the system worked to keep it locked. That's how control survives, not through force, but through erasure. Through convincing someone that speaking would cost more than staying quiet. But it did cost him. It cost him sleep. It cost him deals. It cost him confidence and connection. And worst of all, it made him question himself, his instincts, his choices, his memory. That is the damage few people talk about. The aftermath, the internal war, the way the trauma doesn't need to be shouted to be real. It just needs to linger. And in Brad's case, it lingered in every silence, in every mirror, in every unspoken rule he followed for years after walking out of that house. What made his testimony so powerful wasn't just the content, it was the timing. Brad came forward, not to lead a movement, but to break a pattern, not to reclaim fame, but to reclaim self. And in doing so, he changed the way we think about power, about how it moves, about who it touches, about how it hides in plain sight. Because on that day, Brad Pitt didn't speak as a celebrity. He spoke as a man stripped of status, stripped of safety, and finally, stripped of silence. And that's What made it unforgettable? Not the name, not the drama, but the humanity. The willingness to say, this happened, and it nearly erased me. And for everyone watching, inside the courtroom or on screens around the world, that truth echoed far beyond the testimony. Because if it could happen to Brad Pitt, it could happen to anyone. And maybe, just maybe, that's what it finally takes for people to listen.